In the quiet, rolling hills of rural Cullman, Alabama, a 78-year-old widow named Dorothy Mae Henderson was about to experience the ultimate betrayal. What started as a long-awaited family reunion took a shocking turn when her own children, those she had nurtured and sacrificed for, decided to hide her life-saving medications as a cruel joke. Dorothy wasn't your typical Southern grandmother. For over a decade, she had single-handedly managed a sprawling 400-acre pecan and cattle farm, a property valued in the millions, a testament to her sharp mind, unyielding spirit, and quiet strength. When her children brazenly dismissed her critical medical needs, they had no idea they were igniting the fuse of the most calculated, meticulous response in the family's long history. Dorothy's methodical actions would not only dismantle their carefully constructed inheritance expectations, but would, with chilling precision, ensure that those who threw her life away found themselves utterly and irrevocably thrown out of her life and her legacy. What began as cruel humor would become a definitive, unyielding form of perfect justice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dorothy Mae Henderson stood at her kitchen window, watching the dust cloud trail behind Michael's gleaming black SUV as it turned up the long gravel driveway. At 78, she still moved with a purpose that belied her years, navigating the familiar pathways of her farmhouse with an almost preternatural grace. Yet, this morning, the ritual of organizing her medications had taken longer than usual. 7 different pills, small soldiers of wellness, were meticulously lined up in perfect rows on the sun-drenched kitchen counter. Her heart medication, the precise dosage for her diabetes management, the tiny blue tablet for blood pressure regulation. Each one was precisely timed, each one absolutely essential to the rhythm of her life. "They're here," she murmured to herself, smoothing the elegant floral print of her best Sunday dress and checking her reflection in the antique hallway mirror. The lines around her eyes had deepened since last year's reunion, etched by time and quiet solitude, but her silver hair, still thick and lustrous, was neatly pinned, and her posture remained ramrod straight, a testament to decades spent working the land and standing firm against life's storms. She had spent 3 exhaustive days preparing for this weekend, scrubbing rooms that hadn't seen visitors in months, polishing antique furniture until it gleamed, and stocking the pantry with her children's favorite Southern comfort foods from their childhood. Fried chicken, pecan pie, fresh-baked biscuits. Every dish was a silent offering of love, a hope that this reunion might mend some of the invisible fissures that had grown between them over the years. The screen door slammed with a resounding thud as Michael emerged from his car, his expensive tailored suit, though wrinkled from the long drive from Birmingham, doing little to disguise the weariness beneath his forced confidence. At 52, he carried himself with the perpetual swagger of a man constantly one step ahead of his creditors, a trait Dorothy knew all too well from years of bailing him out of various business ventures. Dorothy had raised him to be strong, perhaps too strong, she often thought. Now that strength had curdled into something harder, more demanding, a sharp-edged ambition that often overshadowed genuine warmth. "Mom!" Michael's voice boomed across the yard, hearty and performative, designed to carry, designed to impress. "Look at this place. You've really outdone yourself with the landscaping. The azaleas are just magnificent." Behind him, Olivia climbed out of her minivan, her movements careful and measured, a subtle stiffness in her posture. At 49, Olivia possessed an acute intelligence that had been shaped by years of mediating family conflicts, a burden she often carried with a sigh. Her husband Daniel had stayed in Atlanta this time, a detail that hadn't escaped Dorothy's keen notice, though Olivia offered no explanation beyond a vague, quote, commitment. Their teenagers, Chloe and Noah, emerged reluctantly from the vehicle, already absorbed in the glow of their phones, their faces illuminated by screens rather than the warm Alabama sun. Youngest, Thomas, brought up the rear in his beat-up pickup truck, the engine rattling with the particular sound of deferred maintenance and neglect. Dorothy's youngest son stumbled slightly as he got out, and she caught the telltale scent of stale beer on the morning breeze. 45 years old and still living in the trailer behind the barn, Thomas approached every family gathering like a child, hoping to finally earn his place at the adult table, yearning for an acceptance that seemed perpetually just out of reach. "Welcome home," Dorothy called, opening her arms wide to embrace each of them in turn. Michael's hug was quick, almost perfunctory, his gaze already sweeping across the property, calculating, assessing, taking inventory of what had changed, what had been improved, since his last visit. Dorothy could almost hear the financial ledger ticking in his mind. Olivia's embrace lingered longer, heavy with unspoken guilt, a silent apology for battles not fought, words not spoken. Thomas's was desperate, clinging, smelling of alcohol and regret, a plea for something he couldn't articulate. "Grandma!" Chloe's genuine enthusiasm cut through the adult tension like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. At 16, Margaret's eldest granddaughter still possessed the clarity and unvarnished honesty that her parents had lost somewhere along the way, buried under layers of expectation and disappointment. "The pecan trees look amazing! Did you plant those new peach saplings by the creek last spring?" Dorothy's voice warmed, a rare, genuine smile gracing her lips. "I thought you might like them. They remind me of you, always reaching for something better, always bearing such sweet fruit." Michael was already on his phone, pacing near the porch, his voice a low, urgent murmur. "I don't care what the bank says, Jerry. The property is worth twice that. Find another appraiser." His voice carried the sharp edge of desperation, poorly disguised as authority, the familiar, frantic energy that always seemed to surround him. Olivia watched her brother with familiar concern, a crease forming between her brows. "Michael, maybe we should focus on family time this weekend? This is a reunion." "This is family time," Michael snapped, covering the phone with his hand. "This is about securing our future, Mom's future." His eyes swept the property with obvious calculation, a ravenous hunger in their depths. 400 acres of prime Alabama farmland, a house that had been lovingly maintained for generations, outbuildings that spoke of careful stewardship and substantial value, an inheritance whispered about for years. Dorothy pretended not to notice the raw assessment in his gaze. She'd seen that look before, in the eyes of developers who'd offered to buy her land, in the faces of distant relatives who only called when they needed money. But seeing it in her eldest son's eyes felt like swallowing broken glass, a bitter taste that lingered. "Come inside," she said, forcing a brittle brightness into her voice, a shield against the creeping coldness in her heart. "I've made your favorite pot roast, and Olivia, Michael, I even found your grandmother's recipe for apple dumplings." The tour of the house became an exercise in subtle inventory. Michael noted the new furnace, the updated electrical work, the solid hardwood floors that would photograph well in a real estate listing. He ran a hand over the polished banister, imagining auction paddles. Olivia admired the family photographs lining the hallway, a superficial nod to sentiment, but Dorothy caught her studying the antique furniture with the keen eye of someone mentally cataloging valuable items, calculating their worth, their potential for liquidation. Only Thomas seemed genuinely interested in the stories behind the improvements, in the history etched into the very beams of the house. "You did all this electrical work yourself, Mom?" he asked, a flicker of genuine admiration in his eyes. "Maria helped," Dorothy replied, her voice softening at the mention of the name. "She's handy with tools, more useful than most people give her credit for." "Maria's the housekeeper?" Michael asked, though they all knew Maria Santos was far more than that. For 5 years, she'd been Dorothy's part-time caregiver, driver, companion, and increasingly, her closest confidant, a steady presence in a world that often felt adrift. "She's family," Dorothy said quietly, noting how Michael's jaw tightened at the word, a subtle shift in the air, a hint of unspoken resentment. Lunch progressed with the careful choreography of a family that had perfected the art of avoiding real conversation. Michael dominated the discussion with boisterous stories of his latest sales strategies, his voice growing louder, more emphatic, as he tried to convince himself as much as his audience of his success. Olivia deflected every attempt to discuss her own life in Atlanta, particularly when Dorothy asked about Daniel's absence. "He's covering the practice this weekend," Olivia explained, a forced smile on her lips. Dr. Matthews's daughter is getting married. It was a reasonable explanation, one that didn't quite ring true. Dorothy had learned to read the spaces between her children's words, the careful omissions that revealed more than any confession, the practiced evasions. Thomas drank steadily throughout the meal, his contributions growing more slurred and defensive with each beer, a familiar pattern of self-destruction. When Michael made a casual comment about people who can't handle their responsibilities, a veiled jab at Thomas's lifestyle, Thomas's face flushed red, his eyes narrowing. "At least I'm not leveraged up to my eyeballs," Thomas muttered, the words hanging in the air like a challenge. The temperature at the table dropped 10 degrees. Michael's fork froze halfway to his mouth, and Olivia immediately began her practiced role as family mediator. "Let's not," she began, her voice strained. "Let's not what?" Michael's voice carried a warning, a subtle menace. "Thomas, you want to finish that thought?" Dorothy watched the familiar, suffocating dynamic unfold. Michael asserting dominance, Thomas shrinking back, Olivia desperately trying to maintain a fragile peace. It was a dance they'd performed for decades, and she was tired of watching it, tired of the pretense, tired of the unspoken animosity. "Boys," she said quietly, but with enough steel in her voice to command attention, to cut through the tension. "This is supposed to be a celebration, a time for joy." The afternoon brought a temporary reprieve, a fragile calm, as Chloe, with her bright, open spirit, helped Dorothy in the pecan orchard, her laughter echoing among the trees, while the adults dispersed across the property, each lost in their own thoughts, their own unspoken anxieties. But the peace was fragile, built on careful avoidance rather than genuine harmony. As evening approached, Dorothy retreated to the kitchen to prepare dinner, her evening medications waiting patiently on the counter in their precise arrangement, a silent sentinel of health. Through the window, she could see Michael on the phone again, his free hand gesticulating angrily, his voice rising and falling in sharp, desperate tones. Thomas sat on the porch steps, working through his fourth beer of the day, his shoulders slumped. Olivia stood between them, literally and figuratively, her shoulders carrying the invisible weight of trying to hold a family together that seemed determined to fracture, to crumble under the weight of its own dysfunction. The first direct comment about her medications came during dinner preparation. Dorothy had excused herself to take her evening pills when Michael appeared in the kitchen doorway, leaning casually against the frame, a smirk playing on his lips. "Mom, don't you think that's a bit much?" He gestured toward the array of bottles lined up on the counter, a dismissive wave of his hand. "Dr. Peterson prescribed each one for a specific condition," Dorothy replied evenly, her voice betraying none of the tremor she felt inside. "Dr. Peterson's been telling old people they need more pills since I was in high school," Michael said with a laugh that held no humor, a chilling emptiness. "Half of these are probably unnecessary. You're sharper than most people half your age." Olivia joined them, drawn by the tension in Michael's voice, a flicker of concern mixed with something else, something less defined, in her eyes. "Mom does seem to manage just fine," she said carefully, a subtle hint of agreement in her tone. "Maybe a second opinion wouldn't hurt." Dorothy felt something cold settle in her chest, a creeping dread. Her children saw her careful health management, her meticulous adherence to her regimen, not as responsible self-care, but as evidence of weakness, of unnecessary anxiety that inconveniently disrupted their perception of her as the eternally capable, invincible matriarch. "I'll discuss it with my doctor," she said, her voice firm, though she had no intention of doing so. The conversation was not about her health, it was about their control. Thomas wandered in, a fresh beer in hand, and caught the tail end of the conversation, his eyes bleary. "What are we talking about?" "Mom's pill collection," Michael said with that same hollow laugh, that unsettling, dismissive tone. "We're staging an intervention." "Michael," Olivia warned, but her protest lacked conviction, a mere whisper against the growing tide. "I'm serious," Michael continued, warming to his theme, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous conviction. "Look at her. Does she look sick to you? Does she act sick?" She's letting some small-town doctor convince her she's falling apart when she's healthier than any of us. It's ridiculous. Dorothy turned to face her children, these adults she'd raised and sacrificed for, who now stood in judgment of her most basic act of self-preservation. The careful scheduling that kept her heart rhythm steady, her blood sugar controlled, her blood pressure from spiking into dangerous territory. They saw it as neurosis, as an inconvenient fixation. Maybe, Thomas said, swaying slightly, his words slurred, maybe we should show her she doesn't need all that stuff, like an experiment. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to catch. A spark of malicious intent. Dorothy saw the perverse idea take root in Michael's eyes, saw Olivia's weak protest die on her lips, consumed by the unspoken desire for an easier future. Just for a day, Michael said thoughtfully, his gaze fixed on Dorothy, a chilling calculation in his eyes. To prove a point, show her she's stronger than she thinks. That's not, Olivia began, a flicker of genuine alarm. It's one day, Michael interrupted, his voice firm, dismissive. 24 hours. What could happen? Dorothy felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, the very foundation of trust she'd built with her children, cracking like ice in a sudden spring thaw. They were discussing her health, her very life, her autonomy, as if she weren't standing right there, as if she were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected, a mother to be loved. I think, she said quietly, her voice imbued with a new, steely resolve, I'll take my evening medications now. But the seed had been planted, a venomous thought blossoming in their minds. She could see it in Michael's calculating expression, in the way Olivia avoided her eyes, in Thomas's desperate, pathetic need to please his older brother, to gain his approval, no matter the cost. As Dorothy lined up her pills and took them one by one, she felt the first chill of genuine fear, not fear of her medical conditions. She'd made peace with those long ago, but fear of her own children, and what they might convince themselves was best for her, what cruelties they might inflict under the guise of help. Outside, the Alabama wind picked up, rustling through the pecan groves that stretched toward the horizon, the same land her late husband, Thomas Sr., had worked until the day he died, the same earth that had sustained their family for decades. Tomorrow was Sunday, and her children would be here for one more day. Dorothy had no idea it would be the last day she would ever trust them with her life. As she prepared for bed, meticulously organizing tomorrow's medications in their small plastic containers, she caught Michael watching her from the hallway. His expression was thoughtful, calculating, and something else she couldn't quite identify, something that looked disturbingly like cold, unyielding resolution. Dorothy's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the small plastic container where her morning medications should have been. The kitchen counter, usually organized with military precision, gleamed under the soft morning light, holding only empty space where 7 vital pills normally waited in their labeled compartments. Her heart medication, the insulin she needed to manage her diabetes, her blood pressure pills, all gone. A hollow ache began to form in the pit of her stomach. That's strange, she murmured, her voice barely a whisper, as she checked the drawer beneath, then the small spice rack, her mind racing. Nothing. Her heart medication, crucial for her atrial fibrillation, her insulin, without which her blood sugar would soar to dangerous levels, her blood pressure pills, vital for keeping her hypertension in check. They were all gone, vanished as if into thin air. A sound of muffled, almost triumphant laughter drifted from the living room, punctuated by Michael's hearty, booming chuckle. It was a sound that, under normal circumstances, would have brought a smile to Dorothy's face, signaling the joyous presence of her family. But now, it resonated with a chilling dissonance, striking a discordant note that echoed the emptiness on her counter. Dorothy felt the first flutter of unease in her chest, not the familiar, benign flutter of her atrial fibrillation that she had learned to manage, but something deeper, something far more insidious. It was a cold, sharp pang that spoke of betrayal, of a violation in a language she didn't want to understand, a language that chilled her to the bone. "Michael?" she called, her voice steady despite the growing concern that was tightening its grip on her. "Have you seen my medications?" Her eldest son appeared in the doorway. a steaming coffee mug in hand, his expression carefully neutral, almost practiced in its blankness. He leaned against the doorframe, a posture of feigned casualness that Dorothy immediately distrusted. "Your what, Mom?" he asked, his tone deliberately vague, his eyes avoiding hers. "My morning pills," Dorothy replied, her voice firmer now, betraying the rising anxiety. "They were right here on the counter, where I always leave them." Michael's pause lasted exactly 1 second too long, an almost imperceptible hesitation that spoke volumes. "Maybe you already took them," he suggested, a saccharine sweetness in his voice that was utterly disingenuous. "You know how routines can blur together, especially as you get older." The suggestion hit Dorothy like a bucket of cold water, an icy shock that jolted her to her core. She had been meticulously managing her medications for 15 years, ever since her diabetes diagnosis, a daily ritual as ingrained as breathing, as automatic as the rising of the sun. The routine was her anchor, her lifeline, a testament to her disciplined approach to her health. She knew with absolute, unshakable certainty that she hadn't taken them. Her mind, as sharp and clear as the Alabama morning, rebelled against the insinuation. "I haven't taken them," she said firmly, her voice hardening with resolve. "They're missing. Someone has taken them." Olivia joined them, her movements quick and nervous, a subtle darting of her eyes betraying her unease. Behind her, Thomas lurked in the hallway, his shoulders hunched, his gaze fixed somewhere on the floor, pointedly avoiding Dorothy's eyes. The three of them formed a loose semicircle around her, a subtle encirclement, and Dorothy felt something shift irrevocably in the air. A subtle but profound change in dynamics that made her skin prickle with an instinctive warning. The air in her kitchen, once filled with the comforting aroma of coffee and breakfast, suddenly felt heavy, charged with unspoken truths and looming conflict. "Mom, you're being a little dramatic," Olivia said, her voice carrying a forced lightness, an artificial cheerfulness that grated on Dorothy's nerves. "They have to be somewhere. You probably just misplaced them. We can help you look." "Dramatic?" Dorothy's tone sharpened, cutting through Olivia's false calm like a knife. "These medications keep me alive, Olivia. My heart rhythm depends on them. My blood sugar depends on them. See? This is exactly what we were talking about," Michael interrupted, setting his coffee mug down with deliberate, theatrical casualness, the clatter echoing in the tense silence. "You've convinced yourself you can't function without all those pills. What if we proved you wrong?" The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was already spreading, suffocating and acrid, burning with a malicious intent. Dorothy stared at her son, her mind reeling, trying desperately to process the unthinkable, to grasp the horrifying implications of what she was hearing. "What do you mean, proved me wrong?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably behind Olivia, his face flushed, whether from alcohol or guilt, Dorothy couldn't tell. He mumbled, "It's just for today, Mom, just to show you that you're stronger than you think, that you don't need all that stuff." The truth hit her with the brutal force of a physical blow, a stunning impact that left her breathless, winded, as if all the air had been knocked from her lungs. They had taken her medications, deliberately, as some twisted, perverted form of intervention, designed to prove a point that existed only in their own warped minds, a point that utterly disregarded her very real, very vital medical needs. "You took them," she stated, her voice flat, devoid of question, filled only with dawning horror. "We're helping you," Michael said, his voice taking on the patronizing, insufferable tone he used with difficult customers, the one that made Dorothy's skin crawl. "You've become dependent on the idea that you need all those chemicals. One day without them won't hurt you. It'll do you good, actually. Clear your head." "One day?" Dorothy felt her chest tighten, a constricting band of fear and anger. Whether from rising panic or the terrifying absence of her heart medication, she couldn't be sure. "Michael, I have atrial fibrillation. My insulin regulates my blood sugar. You can't just—" "You're fine," Olivia interrupted, but her voice wavered, a telltale tremor. She glanced at Michael, then back at Dorothy, her eyes pleading for a different reaction. Look at you, you're talking, walking, thinking clearly. Those pills are a crutch, Mom. A psychological crutch. You rely on them too much. Dorothy looked at her daughter, her intelligent, educated daughter, who had somehow convinced herself that 15 years of careful medical management, a regimen designed to keep her alive and thriving, was merely hypochondria, a figment of an old woman's imagination. Olivia, please, this isn't a game, Dorothy pleaded, a desperate edge to her voice. My blood sugar it'll be fine for 24 hours, Michael said firmly, his voice unwavering, his conviction absolute. Millions of people live without medication. You did it for 63 years before. Before I was diabetic. Dorothy's voice rose, and she felt the familiar spike of stress that her blood pressure medication was designed to control. The internal alarm bells ringing loudly. Before my heart condition. You can't just... Mom, you're getting worked up over nothing, Thomas said, his words slightly slurred, his face a mask of discomfort. Chill out. It's not like we're trying to hurt you. The casual dismissal of her fear, the reduction of her genuine life-threatening medical needs to neurotic worry, hit Dorothy harder than any physical blow. These were her children, the people she'd raised, sacrificed for, loved unconditionally, and they were treating her like a confused child who needed to be managed rather than respected. They were gaslighting her, undermining her reality, and putting her life at grave risk, all for a perverse joke. Where are they? She demanded, her voice low but laced with steel, a steely resolve that belied the terror she felt. I want my medications back. Now. Tomorrow, Michael said with chilling finality, his eyes glinting with a cold, almost triumphant satisfaction. We'll give them back tomorrow evening, after you've proven to yourself that you don't need them, after you've seen how strong you are without them. Dorothy felt the room tilt slightly, a dizzying sensation. Her blood sugar was already beginning to fluctuate, her body missing the careful regulation she'd maintained for years. A dull ache settled behind her eyes, and a wave of nausea washed over her. But worse than the burgeoning physical symptoms was the profound, soul-crushing emotional devastation of realizing that her children, her own flesh and blood, saw her not as a competent adult managing serious chronic health conditions, but as a hypochondriac who needed to be humored, corrected, even punished for her perceived weaknesses. This is elder abuse, she said quietly, the words emerging from her lips almost a whisper, but imbued with the weight of truth. Michael laughed, actually laughed. A short, sharp, dismissive bark of a laugh. Mom, don't be ridiculous. We're your children. We love you. We're trying to help you realize you're healthier than you think. You'll thank us for this later, you'll see. The laughter was the breaking point, the final, shattering blow. Dorothy looked at her 3 children, really looked at them, and saw strangers. Strangers who had decided they knew better than her doctors, better than her own body, better than 15 years of carefully managed medical care that had kept her alive. I'm calling Dr. Peterson, she said, moving purposefully toward the antique rotary phone on the kitchen wall, her fingers fumbling slightly with the old dial. And tell him what? Michael's voice hardened, taking on a dangerous edge, a veiled threat. That your loving children are concerned about your overmedication? I'm sure he'll be very interested to hear about your psychological dependence on pills you probably don't need. It'll be quite the story for the whole town. Dorothy's hand froze on the phone receiver. Michael's tone carried a threat she couldn't quite name, a chilling implication, but the message was clear. They had already crafted their narrative. If she sought help, if she dared to expose their cruelty, she would be painted as the problem, the neurotic old woman, the one whose judgment was impaired. They would twist the narrative, making her the villain, and themselves the well-meaning, if misguided, heroes. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, illuminating the empty space where her medications should have been, casting long, accusing shadows across the pristine counter. Dorothy felt her heart begin to race, a frantic drumbeat in her chest. Whether from sheer panic, the critical missing medication, or the awful, dawning recognition of her complete vulnerability, she couldn't tell. Her children had taken her lifeline, her very means of survival, and convinced themselves they were doing her a favor. They had turned her medical needs into a joke, her health into a dangerous experiment, her autonomy into a problem to be solved. And as Dorothy stood there, surrounded by the people who were supposed to protect her, to cherish her, she realized with a profound, terrifying clarity that she was entirely alone. The cruel jest had begun, but Dorothy Mae Henderson didn't know yet that by evening, it would nearly kill her. The afternoon sun cast long, elongated shadows across Dorothy's kitchen floor as she sat at the sturdy oak table, her hands folded tightly in her lap, fingers interlocked, pressing hard into her skin, seeking an anchor, a physical sensation to ground her in the swirling chaos within. 6 agonizing hours had passed since the terrifying discovery of her missing medications, and her body was beginning to register their absence in ways that terrified her, each new symptom a stark reminder of her children's malicious prank. Her heart fluttered irregularly in her chest, not the familiar gentle skip she'd grown accustomed to managing, but erratic, forceful beats that seemed to echo in her ears, a frantic drum against her ribs. It was an alarm, a desperate cry from an organ struggling to maintain its rhythm without the precise chemical regulation it relied upon. The glucose monitor on her wrist, a constant companion, displayed numbers that made her stomach clench with an icy dread. Without her morning insulin, her blood sugar was climbing steadily, relentlessly, into dangerous, life-threatening territory. She felt a tremor starting in her hands, a fine, almost imperceptible shake, and a creeping numbness in her fingertips. Her vision, usually so sharp, seemed to haze at the edges, and a persistent, dull ache throbbed behind her eyes. "Maria should be here soon," she whispered to herself, the words a desperate plea for hope, clinging to the routine that had become her anchor in these turbulent waters. Every Sunday, at precisely 2 o'clock, Maria Santos arrived for their weekly check-in, bringing groceries, fresh produce from the market, and the kind of genuine, uncomplicated care that Dorothy had forgotten could exist without expectation, without agenda, without a hidden motive. Maria was her rock, her confidant, a lighthouse in the gathering storm. Through the kitchen window, Dorothy could see her children, scattered across the sprawling property, seemingly oblivious to her silent suffering. Michael paced near the barn, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice carrying faint traces of desperation. Even at this distance, he was undoubtedly still plotting, scheming, perhaps trying to secure a loan or a buyer for a piece of the land he already considered his own. Olivia sat on the porch swing with Chloe, their conversation animated but strained, Olivia's gestures tight, Chloe's face a mixture of confusion and concern. Thomas had wandered toward the equipment shed, a fresh beer in hand, despite the early hour. He was lost in his own haze, escaping into oblivion. None of them, not one, had checked on her since breakfast. Not a word, not a glance, not a single question about her well-being. It was as if she had become invisible, or, worse, a problem they had deliberately created and now simply ignored. Dorothy pressed her fingers to her wrist, counting her pulse, each beat a frantic, irregular drum, 98 beats per minute, irregular and forceful. Dr. Peterson had warned her about this, about the devastating consequences of interrupting her heart medication. The atrial fibrillation that had been carefully controlled for years, a sleeping dragon, was reasserting itself with a terrifying vengeance, roaring back to life within her chest. She closed her eyes and tried to focus on breathing, willing herself to calm, to find a rhythm. But each inhale felt insufficient, as if the very air itself had thinned, refusing to fill her lungs completely. This wasn't anxiety, she knew with chilling certainty. This was her body crying out for the precise chemical balance that kept it functioning, that kept her alive. This was the beginning of a medical emergency. The familiar sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway made her eyes snap open with a surge of relief that was almost painful in its intensity, a blinding beacon in the encroaching darkness. Maria's small, unassuming sedan pulled into the driveway, its modest engine a symphony of hope. Dorothy felt tears prick her eyes at the sight of someone who might actually listen, who might actually care about what was happening to her, who saw her as more than just an inheritance. Maria Santos entered through the kitchen door without knocking, as she had done for 5 years, her presence a comforting, familiar grace. At 42, Maria moved with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to caring for others, her every movement purposeful, compassionate. Her dark eyes, observant and empathetic, immediately scanned Dorothy's face with practiced concern, registering the subtle signs of distress. "Signora Dorothy, you don't look well," she said, her voice soft but filled with genuine worry, setting down her woven purse and moving swiftly toward Dorothy. "What's wrong? What has happened?" The simple question, asked with genuine worry rather than dismissive impatience, broke something loose in Dorothy's chest. The dam of her composure burst, and the words, raw with fear and betrayal, tumbled out. "They took my medications," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, thick with emotion. "As a joke. To prove I don't need them." Maria's expression shifted instantly, transforming from concern to alarm, then to something that looked remarkably like a simmering fury, a righteous indignation that made Dorothy's heart swell with unexpected strength. "Who took them?" Maria demanded, her voice low, dangerous. "When?" "My children," Dorothy choked out, her voice catching on a sob. "This morning. They think—" Dorothy's voice caught again, unable to articulate the depth of their cruelty. "They think I'm being dramatic about my health, that the medications are unnecessary." Maria was already moving, her actions swift and decisive, a whirlwind of focused care. She checked Dorothy's pulse, her fingers gentle but firm on Dorothy's wrist, her brow furrowed in concentration. She examined Dorothy's color, noting the faint bluish tint around her lips, a sign of low oxygen. She listened to Dorothy's breathing, quick and shallow. As a seasoned caregiver, Maria had learned to read the subtle signs of medical distress, and what she saw made her face harden with grim determination, her jaw tightening. "How long without your heart medication?" she asked, pulling out her phone, her fingers already flying across the screen. "Since last night," Dorothy managed, her voice weak. "About 18 hours. "And insulin?" Maria's voice was sharp, urgent. "The same." Maria's fingers flew over her phone screen, dialing with practiced speed. "I'm calling Dr. Peterson," she announced, her voice unwavering. "And then I'm calling 911. "Maria, no." Dorothy reached out her hand, shaking slightly, a desperate plea. "They'll just say I'm overreacting, that it's anxiety. Michael will twist it. He'll say I'm mentally impaired." "Signora!" Maria's voice carried the steel of absolute conviction, a strength Dorothy hadn't known she possessed. "You are not overreacting. Your lips are blue. Your pulse is over 100 and irregular. You are having a medical emergency." The words hung in the air like an undeniable diagnosis, a chilling pronouncement. A medical emergency, caused by her own children's harmless prank. The full, horrific reality of it crashed over Dorothy like a wave. From the living room, the sound of heavy footsteps grew louder, and Michael appeared in the doorway, a look of casual interest on his face. His expression shifted instantly, however, when he saw Maria's determined stance, her phone clutched in her hand. Dorothy caught something calculating in his eyes, a flicker of annoyance, and then a subtle, manipulative shift. "Maria, perfect timing," he said with forced warmth, a practiced, oily charm. "Maybe you can help us convince Mom that she's worked herself up over nothing. She gets a little dramatic about her pills, you know." Maria turned to face him, and Dorothy was startled by the transformation in her demeanor. Gone was the gentle, compassionate caregiver, replaced by someone who looked fully capable of protecting what mattered to her, a fierce guardian. "Where are her medications?" Maria's voice was quiet, dangerously quiet, but it carried an authority that made Michael instinctively step back, his forced smile faltering. "She doesn't need—" "Where are her medications?" Maria repeated, each word precise as a scalpel cut, sharper than any blade. She held up her phone, and Dorothy could see the numbers displayed clearly. 911. "I have emergency services on speed dial. Mrs. Henderson is experiencing cardiac symptoms and diabetic complications due to medication interference. Do you want to explain to the paramedics why you prevented an elderly woman from accessing her prescribed treatments? Michael's face paled, the color draining from his cheeks, leaving him looking ashen, shocked. You can't be serious? She's fine. Look at her. I am looking at her, Maria said, stepping forward, moving to stand protectively between Michael and Dorothy, her presence a solid, unyielding barrier. I see cyanosis around her lips, an irregular pulse, tremor in her hands, and confusion in her eyes that indicates blood sugar dysregulation. What I see, Mr. Michael, is elder abuse. The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of realization that Dorothy could see spreading across Michael's face. Elder abuse. Not a harmless prank, not tough love. Abuse. Olivia appeared behind Michael, drawn by the tension in the voices, her eyes wide with alarm. What's going on? Your mother is having a medical emergency, Maria said, her gaze never leaving Michael's face, her voice steady and accusing. Because you took her medications. We didn't. It's not, Olivia's voice fractured, her composure crumbling. Mom, you said you felt fine this morning. Dorothy looked at her daughter, seeing the first cracks in Olivia's certainty, the desperate attempt to cling to their false narrative. I said no such thing, Dorothy stated, her voice stronger than she thought possible. I told you I needed my medications. You chose not to listen, you chose to ignore me. The truth of it, stark and undeniable, settled over the room like dust after an explosion, suffocating in its honesty. Dorothy watched her daughter's face crumble, the elaborate justifications they'd constructed for themselves beginning to penetrate the flimsy facade. Thomas stumbled into the kitchen, his beer forgotten in his hand, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. Maria, poised and formidable, Michael, pale and defensive, Olivia, visibly shaken. Maria was already dialing, her voice crisp and professional as she spoke to the emergency dispatcher. Yes, I need an ambulance at 7824 Pecan Grove Road, Cullman, Alabama. Elderly female, cardiac patient, medications withheld by family members. Experiencing arrhythmia and hypoglycemia. Michael lunged forward as if to grab the phone, but Maria stepped back, her free hand moving to shield Dorothy, a silent promise of protection. Don't, she said quietly, her voice a warning. Don't make this worse than it already is. Dorothy felt her world tilting, the familiar walls of her kitchen seeming to pulse with each irregular heartbeat, the sounds of the farm fading into a distant hum. But through the growing haze of medical distress, one thought emerged with crystal clarity, a sharp, undeniable truth. Her children had been willing to risk her life to prove a perverse, selfish point. And Maria, this woman who shared no blood with her, who had come into her life as an employee, was the one fighting, truly fighting, to save it. The sound of sirens began to echo across the Alabama plains, growing closer. With each labored breath Dorothy took, a mournful wail cutting through the still afternoon air, signaling the arrival of help and the undeniable truth of her children's betrayal. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The hospital room fell silent, save for the rhythmic, reassuring beep of the monitors that had become Dorothy's constant companions for 3 days. Each soft electronic pulse was a stark contrast to the erratic, frantic rhythm of her heart just hours before, a testament to the meticulous care she had received. Dr. James Peterson, his face etched with a weary but firm resolve, closed her chart with a decisive snap, the sound echoing in the sterile room. His expression was grim, his eyes holding a quiet intensity as he turned to face the 3 adults who, by accident of birth, called themselves her children. Michael stood rigidly, his jaw clenched, a defiant posture that seemed to dare the doctor to accuse him. Olivia wrung her hands, her gaze fixed on the pristine white sheets of Dorothy's hospital bed, unable to meet the doctor's direct stare. Thomas sat hunched in the corner chair, his face a sickly gray, his usual boozy bravado replaced by a profound, if perhaps temporary, remorse. Let me be absolutely clear, Dr. Peterson said. his voice carrying the unimpeachable authority of 30 years in medicine, a quiet power that cut through the tension. Your mother came within hours of a catastrophic heart attack. Her blood sugar spiked to nearly 400, a dangerously high level that could have led to a diabetic coma. At her age, with her pre-existing conditions, severe atrial fibrillation, and type 2 diabetes, this kind of medication interruption, this blatant disregard for her prescribed treatment, could have been fatal. Without Maria's swift action and the rapid response of the paramedics, Mrs. Henderson would not be with us today. He paused, letting the grim weight of his words settle over them, an unspoken accusation hanging in the air. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair, a flicker of defiance still in his eyes, refusing to fully acknowledge the gravity of the situation. "But she seems fine now," he interjected, his voice surprisingly steady, a desperate attempt to minimize their culpability. "She seems fine now?" Dr. Peterson repeated slowly, his voice dripping with an icy disdain, his gaze unwavering, pinning Michael in place. "She seems fine, Mr. Michael, because we've been administering her life-saving medications intravenously for 72 hours straight. She seems fine because we've been monitoring her heart rhythm around the clock, minute by excruciating minute. She seems fine because dedicated medical professionals took her health seriously when her own family wouldn't, when her own children, those who should have protected her, actively sabotaged her care." Dorothy watched the exchange from her hospital bed, feeling strangely detached from the drama unfolding around her, as if observing a scene from a poorly written play. The medications were flowing through her system again, a comforting warmth spreading through her veins. Her heart rate had stabilized, a steady, rhythmic beep on the monitor beside her bed. Her blood sugar was controlled, back within safe parameters. The tremor in her hands had subsided, her vision cleared, and the dull ache in her head had receded. But something fundamental had shifted. During those terrifying hours when her body had betrayed her, or rather, when her children had brutally betrayed her body, a part of her, a deep, unwavering part that had once held unconditional love and unwavering trust for them, had irrevocably broken, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. It was a wound that no amount of medical intervention could heal. "Doctor," Olivia began, her voice small, barely a whisper, thick with what sounded like genuine regret, "we didn't realize. We truly didn't understand the severity." "You didn't realize, Mrs. Olivia," Dr. Peterson interrupted, his voice sharp, cutting through her flimsy excuse, "because you chose not to listen. Mrs. Henderson has been diligently managing these complex medical conditions successfully for 15 years. Every single medication in her regimen serves a specific, vital purpose. What you did wasn't a prank, a misguided attempt at tough love. It was medical endangerment. It was reckless. It was a direct, life-threatening assault on your mother's well-being." Thomas hadn't spoken since entering the room. He sat hunched deeper in the corner chair, his face still gray with what Dorothy hoped was genuine remorse, his gaze fixed on some distant point, unable to meet anyone's eyes. But Michael, true to form, remained utterly unchanged, still calculating, still defensive, already crafting his next argument, his next deflection. "We appreciate your concern, Doctor," Michael said with practiced smoothness, a sickening veneer of civility. "But family matters are complicated. Our mother has always been prone to worry about her health. She exaggerates things. It's her nature." Dorothy felt something cold and crystalline form in her chest, a profound chill that settled deep into her bones. Even now, even after 3 days in intensive care, after nearly dying due to their actions, Michael was dismissing her very real medical needs as mere neurosis, a figment of her imagination, an inconvenience to be managed. The realization settled over her like a suffocating winter frost, a blanket of absolute clarity. Her children, or at least Michael and Olivia, would never truly see her as anything more than an inconvenience to be managed, a financial resource to be tapped, an obstacle to their perceived inheritance. The unconditional love she had poured into them for decades had been met with calculated self-interest, callous disregard, and outright cruelty. "Mrs. Henderson," Dr. Peterson turned to her directly, his voice softening slightly, imbued with genuine concern and respect. "You'll be discharged tomorrow. I want to see you in my office next week. We need to discuss some critical changes to your care plan, specifically safeguards to ensure this egregious incident never, ever happens again." He gave Michael a pointed look, a silent promise of consequences, before excusing himself, leaving the three siblings alone with their mother in the hushed, accusing silence of the hospital room. After the doctor left, Dorothy's children attempted what she supposed they imagined was reconciliation, a clumsy, half-hearted performance of concern. Michael, ever the grand gesture, produced a bouquet of wilted, generic flowers from the hospital gift shop, their artificial cheerfulness doing little to dispel the gloom. Olivia offered, with an almost frantic eagerness, to stay longer, to help with her recovery, to run errands, anything to alleviate her burgeoning guilt. Thomas mumbled apologies that still carried the faint, persistent odor of stale beer, even though he hadn't had a drink in days. His words clumsy, ill-formed, his eyes still avoiding hers. Dorothy accepted their gestures with gracious smiles and hollow words, polite acknowledgments that masked the profound emptiness she felt. But inside, something new was stirring, something cold and crystalline, calculating, measuring, planning with the precision of a master architect designing the most important structure of her career. A quiet, terrifying resolve began to solidify within her. "I think," she said, her voice careful, deliberate, "I need to update my will. This health scare has reminded me that I'm not immortal. It's time to put my affairs in order." Michael's eyes, which had been downcast, shot up, sharpening with immediate, ravenous interest, his previous feigned remorse vanishing in an instant. Dorothy caught the quick, almost imperceptible glance he exchanged with Olivia, a silent communication of relief and renewed hope. Even now, even in her hospital bed, even after nearly killing her, their minds were fixed solely on money, on the vast acreage, the investments, the inheritance they believed was rightfully theirs. "Mom, you don't need to worry about that right now," Olivia said quickly, her voice laced with a subtle anxiety, a desperate attempt to steer the conversation away from anything that might threaten their perceived future. "Focus on getting better. That's all that matters." "Actually," Dorothy replied, her voice imbued with a newfound quiet authority, "I think now is the perfect time. Dr. Peterson says I have years left, but I want to be responsible, make sure everything is in order. My legacy needs to reflect my true values, my true relationships." She watched her children process this information, saw the palpable relief flood their faces as they interpreted her words as reassurance about their inheritance, a confirmation that their future was secure. They had no idea that her mind was already working with the chilling clarity of someone who had finally, truly seen the unvarnished truth about the people she'd raised, the true depths of their greed and selfishness. The seeds of retribution had been sown. 2 weeks later, Dorothy sat across from Mrs. Evelyn Hayes in the attorney's office in downtown Cullman, her hands steady, her resolve unwavering, as she signed document after document. Mrs. Hayes had been the Henderson family lawyer for 20 years, handling everything from land deeds to her late husband's estate, but she'd never seen Dorothy quite like this. Calm, focused, methodical in her planning, her eyes holding a steely glint Dorothy had rarely displayed. "Are you absolutely certain about these changes, Dorothy?" Mrs. Hayes asked, reviewing the voluminous papers, her brow furrowed with a mixture of concern and professional obligation. "This is a significant restructuring of your entire estate. It's quite unconventional." "I've never been more certain of anything in my life, Evelyn," Dorothy replied, her voice firm, leaving no room for doubt. "My children have shown me exactly who they are. Their actions speak volumes. I'm simply responding accordingly. This is not about anger, Evelyn. This is about justice. And about ensuring my legacy reflects true care, not just bloodlines." The new will was a masterpiece of legal precision, a meticulously crafted document of consequences. Michael, who had orchestrated the medication prank, who had shown the most calculated disregard for her life, would receive exactly $1, the legal minimum required to prevent him from claiming he'd been forgotten or unfairly excluded. It was a symbolic gesture, a profound statement that his worth to her, in the end, amounted to nothing more than a single, solitary dollar. Olivia, who had enabled the abuse through her weakness, her silent complicity, would inherit Dorothy's collection of antique family photographs and nothing more. A bittersweet reminder of a past she had failed to uphold and a future she had forfeited. Only Thomas, who had shown genuine, if clumsy, remorse during the hospital stay, who had begun to take halting steps towards sobriety, would receive a small trust fund. It would be just enough to help him get sober, to find his footing, to build a life for himself, but not enough to enable his destructive patterns, his old addictions. It was a lifeline, a chance at redemption, carefully calibrated. The bulk of Dorothy's vast estate, the 400-acre pecan and cattle farm, the substantial investments, the carefully accumulated wealth of a lifetime, the very legacy her children believed was theirs by right, would go to three recipients. First, Maria Santos, who had shown more genuine care, more unwavering loyalty, more selfless devotion in 5 years than Dorothy's children had in 50. Maria would receive a substantial parcel of prime land, including the main house, and a significant portion of Dorothy's liquid assets to provide for her family and secure their future. Second, the Cullman Senior Center, where Dorothy had volunteered for decades, an organization that truly understood and supported the elderly. Third, a new scholarship fund for immigrant families in Alabama seeking educational opportunities, a cause close to Maria's heart and increasingly to Dorothy's. It was a profound act of reprioritization, a declaration that true family was forged in action, not merely in blood. "Maria doesn't know yet," Dorothy told Evelyn, a soft smile gracing her lips, a rare moment of tender anticipation. "I want to tell her myself when the time is right. It's too important." Evelyn nodded, understanding the delicate nature of the situation, the immense implications of such a gift. "And your children?" Evelyn asked, her voice cautious. "They'll find out, when they need to know," Dorothy said with quiet, steely satisfaction, her eyes gleaming with a newfound resolve. "For now, let them believe they're still in control. Let them think their little prank had no lasting consequences beyond a hospital stay. Let them live with their illusions. The truth, when it comes, will be far more impactful." As Dorothy drove her old pickup truck home from the lawyer's office, the Alabama countryside unfolding around her, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: the profound peace that comes from taking absolute control of one's own destiny. Her children had taught her a valuable, albeit bitter, lesson about the fundamental difference between true family and mere blood relations. They'd shown her that love based on expectation, on entitlement, wasn't love at all. It was a transaction, a demand. Now she would teach them a lesson in return, a lesson about respect, about consequences, about the undeniable fact that power, real power, belonged to the person who controlled the purse strings, the person who controlled the narrative. Dorothy Mae Henderson had spent 78 years being generous, forgiving, and accommodating, always putting her family first. Those days were irrevocably over. The intricate architecture of her revenge was now complete, built piece by painstaking piece, brick by deliberate brick. All that remained was the construction, the implementation of her meticulously crafted plan, a quiet revolution that would reshape her legacy and, perhaps, teach a bitter lesson to those who had so carelessly thrown her aside. 3 weeks after Dorothy's hospital discharge, Michael sat hunched over his cramped apartment table in Birmingham, staring at a bank statement that made his stomach churn with a sickening lurch. The numbers hadn't changed in the 20 minutes he'd been studying them, his eyes frantically scanning the figures, but somehow, he kept clinging to a desperate, irrational hope that they would magically rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic, something less final. Overdue, past due, final notice. The words seemed to leap off the page in bold, red ink, each one a stark, undeniable reminder of how desperately he needed his mother's inheritance to materialize now, to save him from the financial precipice he teetered on. He had pinned all his hopes, all his desperate schemes, on the vast wealth of the Henderson farm. The hospital scare, he had convinced himself, had actually been a blessing in disguise. It had reminded everyone, including Dorothy herself, of her mortality. Surely, he reasoned, she'd be updating her wills soon, making generous provisions for her children's financial security, especially for him, her eldest, her most ambitious son. His phone buzzed with an insistent, irritating vibration. It was a text from his ex-wife's lawyer, another stinging reminder about missed alimony payments, a constant, nagging drain on his already depleted resources. Michael deleted it without even bothering to read the full message, his jaw clenching, his face tightening with a familiar rage. He reached for his laptop, his fingers trembling slightly as he logged into the family bank account, an account he'd been meticulously monitoring since his father's death, tracking every deposit, every withdrawal, every cent. The screen loaded, slowly, agonizingly, and Michael's blood pressure spiked, a sudden explosive surge. His eyes fixed on a single, horrifying line. Withdrawal. $50,000 transferred to something called the Cullman Benevolent Senior Living Foundation. His mother, Dorothy, had donated $50,000 to a charity. Without consulting anyone. Without a single word to him, her son, her financial heir. "What the hell?" he muttered, the words a strangled gasp, his mind reeling in disbelief, in a sickening mix of rage and panic. $50,000. It was a significant sum, certainly, a sizable chunk of their inheritance. But it was the principle that terrified him, a cold, creeping dread that coiled in his gut. If Dorothy was making large charitable donations, arbitrary gifts without family input, without his oversight, what else might she decide to give away? What other hidden traps lay in wait? He grabbed his keys, the metal cold against his sweaty palm, and bolted out the door, the drive to Cullman passing in a blur of mounting rage and spiraling panic, his mind consumed by a single, terrifying thought. He had to stop her. He found her in the sprawling garden, kneeling beside her prize-winning tomato plants, her hands gently tending to the vibrant green leaves, her face serene, absorbed in the quiet concentration that had always annoyed him. At 78, fresh from a severe medical emergency that had nearly claimed her life, she should, in his opinion, be inside resting, convalescing, not playing in the dirt like some common farmhand, as he derisively thought. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, without preamble, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, the words clipped and sharp. Dorothy looked up slowly, shading her eyes against the warm Alabama afternoon sun, her gaze calm, unhurried, meeting his with an almost unnerving steadiness. "Hello, Michael. What brings you out here so soon? I thought you were busy with work, or perhaps a new venture." Her voice was mild, but there was a subtle, almost imperceptible undertone of knowing, a hint of steel that Michael, in his rage, completely missed. "I'm busy trying to understand why you donated $50,000 without telling anyone," he said, his voice rising, betraying the barely contained fury that seethed within him. Dorothy's expression didn't change. She simply returned her attention to the tomatoes, her movements deliberate and unhurried, as if he were merely an irritating fly buzzing around her. "It's my money, Michael. I can spend it however I choose. It is, after all, mine." The quiet emphasis on the last word, on mine, was a subtle but profound assertion of autonomy. "But $50,000 to some senior center, Mom," Michael scoffed, his voice laced with contempt. "You need to think about your future, about our future. What if you need that money for medical care, for nursing home expenses? What if you run out?" "I have excellent insurance, Michael," Dorothy replied calmly, her voice even, unperturbed, as she carefully tied a ripe tomato plant to its stake. "And the Cullman Benevolent Senior Living Foundation provides vital meals, activities, and companionship for elderly people in our community who don't have family support, or who have been abandoned." It seemed like a worthy cause, a good use of funds. The implication hung in the air like smoke, thin but pervasive. Michael caught it immediately, the subtle, stinging suggestion that some elderly people, unlike Dorothy, lacked family support, as if he and his siblings hadn't been worried sick during her hospital stay, as if they hadn't shown her the utmost care and concern. The hypocrisy of her statement inflamed him further. "We are your family support," he exploded, his voice rising, losing all pretense of calm. "We've been taking care of you, making sure you're okay. That's exactly why we were concerned about your medications, because we care." He gestured wildly, his hand sweeping across the garden, encompassing the entire farm. "This is our legacy, Mom. You can't just give it away." Dorothy stood slowly, brushing dirt from her gardening gloves with precise, unhurried movements, her gaze finally settling on his face. "Is that what you call it, Michael? Taking care of me?" The question was asked so mildly, so deceptively calmly, that it took Michael a moment to recognize the razor-sharp edge underneath, the chilling steel that now permeated her voice. When he did, something cold and liquid settled in his stomach, a sudden, icy dread. "Mom, if this is about the medication thing," he began, his voice losing some of its belligerence, a desperate attempt to pivot, to defuse the growing tension. "I thought we were past that. You're fine. You recovered completely. Maybe it even proved that you're stronger than you thought, that you don't need all those pills after all." He tried a placating smile, a manufactured charm. Dorothy removed her gloves with deliberate movements, folding them carefully, meticulously, before meeting his eyes. Her gaze was unblinking, unwavering. "Michael, I nearly died." "But you didn't," he said quickly, desperately, cutting her off. "And now you know you can handle more than you thought. That has to be worth something, doesn't it?" He was trying to spin it, to twist the narrative, to turn their near-fatal prank into some kind of personal triumph for her. Dorothy studied her eldest son with the same unwavering attention she'd given her tomatoes. Careful, assessing, deciding what needed to be pruned away, what was simply dead weight. "I've been thinking a lot about worth lately," she said, her voice soft, almost meditative, but with an underlying current of profound conviction. About what things are really worth, what people are worth. Something in her tone, a subtle shift, an almost imperceptible tightening, made Michael's skin prickle with an instinctive warning, a sense of impending danger. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice now cautious, wary. "I mean that I've lived 78 years, Michael, and I'm finally learning to tell the difference between people who genuinely love me and people who simply love what I can give them. There is a vast difference, and I'm afraid you fall squarely into the latter category." Michael felt the conversation slipping away from him, spiraling into territory he couldn't control, a dangerous, unfamiliar landscape. "Mom, that's not fair. We love you." "We're your children." "Being my children doesn't automatically make you entitled to my estate, Michael," Dorothy stated, her voice calm, utterly devoid of emotion, the words hitting him like a physical blow, a sudden, stunning impact that stole his breath. Michael stared at his mother, seeing a stranger in her familiar face, a woman he suddenly didn't recognize. This wasn't the accommodating, generous woman who had always put family first, who had always been a bottomless well of financial support. This was someone else entirely, someone cold and resolute, someone who looked at him with eyes that calculated his worth and found it utterly wanting. "Entitled?" he managed, his voice hoarse, disbelieving. "Mom, I'm not entitled to anything. But we're family. Families take care of each other." "Yes," Dorothy agreed quietly, her gaze unwavering. "They do. The question is, Michael, who's been taking care of whom, and for what purpose?" Before Michael could formulate a coherent response, before he could mount another frantic defense, Olivia's minivan pulled into the driveway, its engine humming faintly. Perfect timing, as always, Michael thought bitterly. His sister, ever the peacemaker, arriving just when things got difficult, ready to smooth over the hard truths that needed to be faced, ready to mediate the brewing conflict. Olivia emerged from the van with forced brightness, carrying a casserole dish covered with aluminum foil, wearing the practiced smile she used when she was trying desperately to fix things that were far beyond her control. "I brought dinner," she announced, her voice a little too loud, a little too cheerful, though her eyes immediately went to Michael's tense, furious posture and Dorothy's calm, unyielding stillness, instantly sensing the palpable tension in the air. "Everything okay out here?" she asked, her voice laced with thinly veiled anxiety. "Michael's concerned about my charitable giving," Dorothy said with devastating mildness, her voice almost conversational, as if discussing the weather. Olivia's forced smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of alarm. "Oh, well, I'm sure whatever you're doing is wonderful, Mom. You've always been so generous." $50,000, Olivia, Michael cut in bluntly, his voice sharp with accusation. "To a senior center, without consulting anyone." Olivia's face went pale, a sudden stark realization dawning in her eyes. Michael could almost see her mental calculator working, the numbers adding up, the figures shrinking. 50,000 less inheritance. 50,000 that wouldn't be there when they needed it. Her husband's medical practice was successful, but not wealthy enough to fund their children's exorbitant college tuitions without significant assistance. The farm, the vast, rich acres, was supposed to be their security, their unquestioned future. That's very generous, Mom," Olivia said carefully, her voice strained, struggling to regain her composure. "But maybe we should talk about setting up a family foundation. Something we could all be involved in. Make sure your charitable goals align with practical considerations, with the family's needs." She was trying to regain control, to subtly manipulate Dorothy back into the traditional family structure, back into their financial orbit. Dorothy looked between her two children. Michael with his barely concealed desperation, his raw, unbridled greed. Olivia with her diplomatic manipulation, her carefully constructed facade of concern masking her own calculating self-interest. And in that moment, the last of Dorothy's illusions crumbled away, dissolving into the warm Alabama air like mist. Even now, faced with her clear, unmistakable statement of autonomy, of her right to control her own wealth, they were scheming, already working to regain control of her money, to divert it back into their own pockets. "I think," Dorothy said quietly, her voice imbued with a chilling finality, "that my charitable goals are perfectly clear and perfectly practical. I'm giving my money to people and causes that have earned it, through genuine care, through selfless service, through unwavering loyalty." The emphasis on earned wasn't lost on either of her children. Michael's face flushed red with a mixture of shame and fury, while Olivia's diplomatic mask began to crack, revealing the fear beneath. "Mom," Olivia tried again, her voice a desperate plea. "We just want to make sure you're thinking clearly about all this after your health scare. Maybe big financial decisions should wait until..." "Until what, Olivia?" Dorothy interrupted, her voice carrying a new, razor-sharp edge, a steel that Michael had never heard before. "Until I'm too old to think for myself? Until you can have me declared incompetent? Is that the next step in taking care of me?" The accusation hung in the air like a challenge, sharp and undeniable. Michael and Olivia exchanged quick, furtive glances, and Dorothy saw the undeniable truth reflected in their eyes. The idea had already occurred to them. If they couldn't control her through guilt and manipulation, if she persisted in her stubborn independence, they were prepared to consider legal options, to use the very system they despised to seize what they believed was theirs. "Nobody's talking about competency hearings," Michael said quickly, his voice carrying the hollow ring of a man who had absolutely, definitively been thinking about competency hearings. Dorothy smiled then, a slow, cold, knowing expression that made both her children instinctively step back, a sudden, chilling fear in their eyes. "Good," she said quietly, her voice laced with an unspoken threat. "Because that would be a very serious mistake, a mistake you would live to regret." As her children stood stunned in her garden, scrambling to understand how their carefully laid plans had gone so horribly, irrevocably wrong, Dorothy felt a profound sense of clarity wash over her. The war had begun, and they, in their arrogance and greed, had no idea how thoroughly she intended to win it. Michael's hands shook uncontrollably as he gripped the steering wheel, the property deed crumpled tightly on the passenger seat beside him, like irrefutable evidence of his mother's ultimate betrayal. Maria Santos, a goddamn housekeeper, now legally owned the prime 20-acre parcel that bordered the main highway, the same invaluable stretch of land he'd been meticulously counting on to solve his burgeoning financial crisis. The very piece of property that would have been his salvation. $200,000. Gone. Vanished. Irrevocably transferred to a woman who had no legal right to the Henderson legacy, no blood connection to the family that had painstakingly built this empire from stubborn Alabama soil and generations of unyielding determination. He slammed the car door with a force that made the rental shake violently, the sound echoing sharply in the quiet afternoon air, and stalked toward the farmhouse, his vision tinged a furious, dangerous red, consumed by the kind of blinding rage that made any rational thought utterly impossible. Through the kitchen window he could see his mother, Dorothy, calmly, serenely preparing lunch, her movements unhurried, peaceful, as if she hadn't just committed the most devastating act of financial warfare in the entire family history. Dorothy looked up calmly as he burst through the door, his sudden, furious entry shattering the quiet tranquility of the kitchen. Her expression shifted subtly from mild curiosity to watchful caution, her gaze taking in his disheveled appearance, the sweat-stained shirt clinging to his back, his hair wild and unkempt, his eyes blazing with the desperate fury of a man watching his entire future crumble before his very eyes. He looked unhinged, and Dorothy noted it without a flicker of fear. "We need to talk," he said, his voice barely controlled, a low, guttural growl of suppressed anger. "Of course, dear," Dorothy replied, her voice soft, almost saccharine, utterly devoid of fear, laced with an unsettling sweetness. "Would you like some iced tea? It's quite warm today. You look rather agitated." The casual offer, delivered with an almost grandmotherly concern, snapped the last brittle thread of Michael's self-control. "Don't you dare play innocent with me!" he roared, his voice booming through the kitchen, shaking the very glassware in the cupboards. "The highway property, Mom! You gave it to her. You gave Maria Santos $200,000 worth of prime land. How could you?" Dorothy continued slicing tomatoes with steady, unwavering hands, her movements precise, unhurried, as if his furious outburst were nothing more than a distant, inconsequential buzz. "Maria has been more family to me than family has been, Michael," she stated, her voice calm, utterly imperturbable. "She's earned every square foot of that property. Every single penny. She has earned it, where others have not." "Earned it?" Michael's voice cracked with incredulous rage, a high-pitched, desperate sound. "She's a housekeeper. She cleans toilets and brings you groceries. How does that earn her a piece of our family's legacy? What kind of sick joke is this, Mom? What kind of madness?" His profanity hung in the air like acrid smoke from a fire that was rapidly spreading out of control, threatening to consume everything in its path. Dorothy set down her knife slowly, deliberately, the soft clink of metal against wood the only sound in the tense silence. She turned to face her son, her expression calm, utterly composed, but her eyes were cold as winter steel, hard and unyielding. "That woman," she said, her voice dropping to a low, chilling whisper that carried more menace than any shout, "has shown me more genuine care and more profound respect in 5 years than you have shown me in 52. She knows my medications by heart, drives me to every single doctor's appointment, listens patiently when I speak, and treats me like a human being worth caring about, rather than an inconvenience to be managed, a financial burden to be shed. She is a compassionate, decent woman, something I fear you have forgotten how to be. She's manipulating you," Michael shouted, stepping closer, his face contorted with a mixture of fury and desperate fear. "Can't you see it, Mom? She's playing the long game, being sweet and helpful so she can get her hands on our money. It's elder abuse, Mom, financial exploitation. She's taking advantage of you because you're old." Dorothy's laugh was sharp and mirthless, utterly devoid of humor, a chilling, bitter sound that echoed off the kitchen walls. "Elder abuse?" she repeated, her voice laced with cutting sarcasm. "Like hiding my medications? Like telling me I was being dramatic when I nearly died? Like accusing me of being over-medicated while my blood sugar soared and my heart threatened to give out? That kind of elder abuse, Michael? Because if so, you are quite the expert, it seems." The accusation hit Michael like a bucket of cold water, dousing his fiery rage with a sudden drenching shame. But his desperation was stronger than his shame, an all-consuming force. "That was different," he spluttered, his voice hoarse, clinging to his flimsy justifications. "That was family trying to help you realize." "That was attempted murder, Michael," Dorothy stated quietly, her voice flat, emotionless, delivering the crushing truth. Dr. Peterson's exact words, not mine. "You could have killed me. To prove a point about my supposed hypochondria, a point that only existed in your greedy, calculating mind." Michael felt the conversation spiraling wildly beyond his control, his carefully constructed justifications crumbling to dust under his mother's steady, unyielding gaze, exposed for the pathetic lies they were. But the terrifying thought of losing everything, the inheritance that was supposed to save him from bankruptcy, from the relentless creditors and lawyers, from the slow, agonizing dissolution of everything he'd ever worked for, or rather, accumulated and squandered, made him reckless, desperate. "You're not thinking clearly," he said, his voice taking on a menacing, almost threatening edge, a subtle shift in tone that was far more sinister than his earlier rage. "This isn't you, Mom. This vindictive, spiteful person giving away our birthright to strangers. Maybe that medical incident affected you more than we thought. Maybe you need help making these kinds of decisions. Perhaps you're not as sharp as you used to be." The threat was barely veiled, a thinly disguised insinuation of mental incompetence, and Dorothy heard it clearly, understood its chilling implications. Her son was suggesting she was mentally unfit, laying the groundwork for a legal challenge to her autonomy, to her very right to control her own life and property. The same son who had callously endangered her life was now threatening to have her declared unfit to manage her own affairs, to strip her of her dignity and independence. "Are you threatening me, Michael?" Her voice was low, dangerous. "I'm trying to save you from yourself," he exploded, losing all pretense of calm, his face contorted in a furious grimace. "From making decisions you'll regret when you're lying in a nursing home with nothing left because you gave it all away to some manipulative immigrant who saw you coming from a mile away." The racial slur, crude and ugly, embedded in his words, made Dorothy's blood run cold. This was her son. The child she'd raised to be better than this, to show kindness, to extend compassion to people, regardless of their background, their origin. Now he stood in her kitchen, sweating and desperate, revealing the ugly, unvarnished truth of what he'd truly become. A desperate, prejudiced man, consumed by greed. "Get out," she said quietly, her voice imbued with a chilling calm, a quiet power that resonated through the room. "Mom, I'm trying to protect. Get out of my house." Her voice carried the unmistakable authority of a woman who had run a farm, managed a vast fortune, and commanded respect for decades. Now, Michael stared at her, his chest heaving with exertion and rage, his mind frantically searching for a way out, a way to regain control. "You're making a mistake, a huge mistake. I won't let you destroy our family's legacy because some housekeeper has you fooled." "Our family's legacy?" Dorothy stepped closer to her son, and Michael was startled to see no fear in her eyes, only cold, implacable determination, a terrifying resolve. "Michael, you are a gambling addict who hasn't held a steady job in 5 years. You've been divorced twice because you can't manage money or relationships. You endangered my life for a joke. What exactly about that deserves to inherit anything? What part of that constitutes a legacy?" The words hit their target with surgical precision, each one a perfectly aimed blow that found its mark. Michael stumbled backward as if physically struck, his face cycling through a raw mixture of rage, profound hurt, and desperate calculation. "You can't do this," he said, his voice breaking, cracking with a desperate plea. "You can't just cut us out. We're your children. We have rights." "You have the right to earn my respect, Michael," Dorothy replied, with devastating calm, her gaze unyielding. "You've chosen not to exercise that right. Now, You'll live with the consequences of your choices. From the driveway, the sound of car doors slamming echoed faintly, and Dorothy recognized the voices of Olivia and Thomas, approaching the house, drawn by the escalating volume of Michael's furious shouts. Michael heard them too, and his expression shifted, a flicker of cunning and desperate hope replacing his raw fury. "They'll help me stop you," he said, a renewed arrogance in his voice. "Olivia and Thomas won't let you give away their inheritance to some stranger. We'll fight this, Mom. In court, if we have to, we'll prove you're not competent to make these decisions. The whole town will know what you're doing." Dorothy smiled then, a slow, cold, knowing expression that made Michael actually step backward, a shiver running down his spine. "You're welcome to try," she said quietly, her voice a silken threat. "But I should warn you, I've been planning for this conversation much longer than you might think. And I've documented everything. Very carefully." As her other children entered the house, their faces etched with concern and confusion, drawn by the sound of raised voices, Dorothy felt a profound sense of clarity settle over her. The gloves were finally off. The fragile pretense of family harmony was irrevocably shattered. Her children wanted a war over money. She would give them one. And she intended to win, decisively and completely. Pastor John Maxwell had officiated 3 generations of Henderson family weddings and countless Sunday services, but he'd never seen the family matriarch look quite like this. Dorothy sat across from him in his church office, her hands folded calmly in her lap, while he struggled to process the quiet, devastating account she'd just given him about her children's behavior. "Dorothy," Pastor Maxwell asked, his voice gentle but firm, "are you safe in that house? Physically?" She considered the question with the same meticulous attention she gave everything these days. "Physically, yes. Michael is many things, but he is not violent. Emotionally, Pastor, that is a different matter entirely." Word of Michael's furious confrontation with Dorothy had spread through Cullman with the speed only small-town gossip could achieve. Betty Jenkins at the post office had seen him storm out of the farmhouse, tires spitting gravel. Dr. Peterson had quietly mentioned to his wife that the Henderson family situation was concerning. Maria Santos had confided in her sister about Michael's racist outburst and thinly veiled threats. In a town of 800 people, true secrets rarely existed for long. "The thing is, John," Dorothy continued, her voice steady, "I don't think Michael realizes how his behavior looks to other people. He's so focused on what he thinks he deserves that he can't see how his actions appear to the rest of the community." Pastor Maxwell had counseled enough families through bitter financial disputes to recognize the painful signs. Adult children who viewed their aging parents as retirement accounts rather than people. The subtle erosion of respect that often preceded outright abuse. The way money could poison relationships that should have been built on love. "What Michael did with your medications, Dorothy," the pastor said gravely, "that wasn't just disrespectful. It was dangerous. It was an attack. It was attempted murder," she stated, matter-of-factly, devoid of emotion. "Dr. Peterson's words, not mine. But it's taken me this long to fully accept that my own son was willing to risk my life to prove a point about my supposed neurosis." The pastor leaned back in his chair, studying the woman who had been a pillar of his congregation for decades. Dorothy Mae Henderson had organized fundraisers for struggling families, coordinated meal trains for the sick, and quietly paid medical bills for parishioners who couldn't afford them. The idea that her own children would treat her so callously seemed incomprehensible. "And now you're redistributing your estate," he mused. "I'm giving my money to people and causes that have earned it through genuine service and care." Dorothy corrected him gently. "Is that wrong?" Before Pastor Maxwell could answer, his office door opened and Evelyn Hayes, Dorothy's attorney, entered, her expression grim. "Dorothy, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we need to discuss Michael's latest threat. He's talking about filing for guardianship. Claims you're being financially exploited by Maria and making decisions under diminished capacity." Dorothy's expression didn't change. "Let him try," she said, her voice calm. "He's contacted Olivia and Thomas, wants them to sign affidavits supporting his claim that you're mentally impaired." Says the medication incident proves you can't think clearly about medical care, and the property transfers prove you can't think clearly about financial matters. Pastor Maxwell watched Dorothy process this information with the calm focus of a general receiving battle reports. There was no panic, no doubt, only the steady calculation of someone who had already anticipated this move. "What did Olivia and Thomas say?" Dorothy asked. Evelyn's expression softened slightly. "Thomas refused, told Michael that what happened with the medications was wrong and he won't be part of any effort to take away your rights. He's been sober for 3 weeks, by the way, says he wants to earn back your trust properly." A flicker of Dorothy's first genuine smile of the day crossed her face. "And Olivia?" Evelyn paused. Olivia is conflicted. She knows Michael is wrong, but she's scared of losing her inheritance entirely. She's trying to find a middle ground that doesn't exist. The three of them sat in silence for a moment, contemplating the deep fractures that had split the Henderson family beyond repair. Outside, the church bells chimed noon, their familiar melody a poignant reminder of continuity and community in the midst of bitter family chaos. "There's something else," Evelyn continued. "Michael went to Murphy's Diner this morning, trying to rally support for his guardianship petition. Started telling people that Maria had manipulated you, that immigrants were taking advantage of elderly folks who couldn't think straight anymore." Dorothy's jaw tightened. "How did that go over?" "About as well as you'd expect in a town where half the congregation has been helped by your generosity over the years. Joe Murphy asked him to leave, said he wouldn't listen to racist garbage in his establishment." Pastor Maxwell nodded approvingly. "Joe's right. That kind of talk has no place in our community." "It gets worse," Evelyn said. "Michael tried the same story at the feed store, the hardware store, and the bank. People aren't buying it, Dorothy. They've watched Maria care for you with their own eyes. They know the difference between exploitation and genuine affection." Dorothy felt a warm satisfaction settle in her chest. She'd wondered if the community would see through Michael's desperate manipulation, or if they'd be swayed by his bitter storytelling. But Cullman had always been a town that judged people by their actions, not just their words. "In fact," Evelyn continued with a slight smile, "your property transfer to Maria has inspired some interesting conversations. The Millers are thinking about leaving their farm to their longtime foreman instead of their son, who moved to Texas and never visits. Mrs. Watson is considering leaving her house to her caregiver rather than her nephew, who only calls when he needs money." Pastor Maxwell leaned forward with interest. "Dorothy, you've started something here. People are talking about the difference between family and blood relations, about what actually earns inheritance versus what people assume they deserve." Dorothy considered this unexpected consequence of her actions. She'd been focused on her own family's dysfunction, but perhaps her situation wasn't as unique as she'd thought. Perhaps other elderly people in Cullman were also being taken for granted by adult children who saw them as financial resources, rather than human beings deserving of respect. "Michael won't give up easily," she said. "He's desperate. Desperate people do dangerous things." Evelyn nodded grimly. "I've already documented everything. His medication interference, his threats, his attempts to undermine your mental capacity claims. If he tries to pursue guardianship, we'll be ready." Pastor Maxwell stood and moved to his window, looking out at the town that had been his spiritual home for 15 years. "Dorothy, you know I believe in forgiveness, in the power of redemption and second chances. But I also believe in justice, and sometimes justice requires consequences." Dorothy joined him at the window, looking out at the community that had rallied around her without being asked. "Michael taught me that love without respect isn't love at all," she said, her voice quiet, reflective. "It's just expectation dressed up in prettier clothes." "And what about Thomas and Olivia?" "Thomas is trying to change. That counts for something. Olivia—" Dorothy paused, considering her daughter's position. "Olivia is learning that neutrality in the face of abuse isn't kindness. It's enablement. She'll have to decide which side of that line she wants to stand on." As Dorothy prepared to leave the church, Pastor Maxwell placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You know this isn't over, don't you? Michael won't accept defeat gracefully. Dorothy's smile was sharp and knowing. No, he won't. But he's made one crucial mistake in all of this. What's that? He's forgotten that I've been managing money, land, and difficult people for 78 years. He may be desperate, but I'm experienced. And experience usually wins. As she walked toward her car, Dorothy felt the strength of community support surrounding her like armor. Michael had tried to isolate her, to make her doubt her own judgment, to paint her as a confused old woman being manipulated by outsiders. Instead, he'd revealed himself as the manipulator, and she'd revealed herself as someone far more formidable than anyone had imagined. The real battle, she knew, was just beginning. The conference room at Hayes & Associates law firm felt smaller than usual, packed with all the players assembled for what everyone knew would be the final, decisive confrontation. Dorothy sat at the head of the table, Evelyn Hayes at her right, Maria Santos at her left, and Dr. Peterson positioned as her unflappable medical advocate. Across from them, Michael had arranged his own small army, a slick lawyer from Birmingham who specialized in elder law, Olivia looking pale and conflicted, and a stack of papers he clearly believed would be his salvation. Thomas was notably absent, a fact that seemed to surprise Michael more than anyone else. "Thank you all for coming," Evelyn began, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone who had handled dozens of family disputes, but never one quite this vindictive. "Mr. Michael Holloway has requested this meeting to discuss his concerns about his mother's mental capacity and recent financial decisions." Michael's lawyer, a thin man named Richards, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, cleared his throat. "My client has substantial evidence that Mrs. Henderson is suffering from diminished capacity, evidenced by her recent erratic behavior regarding medication management and her inexplicable decision to transfer valuable property to non-family members." The irony of Michael claiming medication mismanagement as evidence of his mother's incompetence wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Dorothy caught Dr. Peterson's eye and saw him suppress what might have been either a smile or a grimace. "Let's review this evidence," Evelyn said smoothly, pulling out her own considerably thicker file. "Mr. Holloway, you claim your mother showed poor judgment regarding her medications. Can you explain the circumstances?" Michael shifted uncomfortably but maintained his aggressive posture. She was obsessing over them, taking too many pills, becoming dependent on unnecessary medications. "We were trying to help her realize she didn't need them all, by hiding them from her, by showing her she was stronger than she thought." Dr. Peterson leaned forward, his expression deadly serious. "Mr. Holloway, I've been your mother's physician for 12 years. Every medication in her regimen is essential for managing life-threatening conditions. When you interfered with her treatment protocol, you caused a medical emergency that required 3 days of intensive care. In medical terms, Mr. Holloway, what you did constitutes assault." Richards tried to interject. "My client's intentions were—" "His intentions, Mr. Richards," Dr. Peterson continued, his voice cutting through, "nearly killed his mother. I have detailed medical records documenting the cardiovascular and metabolic crisis caused by medication interruption. If you'd like to present those in court as evidence of Mrs. Henderson's poor judgment, I'd be happy to explain to a judge exactly whose judgment was actually impaired." Michael's face flushed crimson. "She recovered completely. It proves she didn't need all those pills." "She recovered," Maria said quietly, speaking for the first time, her voice firm, "because paramedics and doctors took her medical needs seriously, when her own children wouldn't." Richards consulted his notes, clearly struggling with a case that was becoming more problematic by the minute. Regardless of the medication incident, there's still the matter of the property transfers. Mrs. Henderson has given away hundreds of thousands of dollars to non-family members, including substantial gifts to this woman. He gestured dismissively toward Maria. Evelyn opened her file with theatrical precision. "Let's discuss Mrs. Henderson's property transfers. Every transaction has been documented, reviewed by independent appraisers, and executed through proper legal channels. Mrs. Henderson demonstrated complete understanding of each decision and articulated clear reasoning for her choices." "Her reasoning," Michael snarled, his voice rising, "is that she's been manipulated by a gold-digging housekeeper who saw an opportunity to stop." Dorothy's voice cut through Michael's rant like a blade, sharp and clear. The room fell silent as Dorothy rose from her chair, her 78-year-old frame somehow commanding the attention of everyone present. When she spoke, her voice carried the accumulated authority of decades managing land, money, and difficult people. "Michael, you want to have me declared incompetent? Let's examine the evidence. For 12 years since your father's death, I've managed a 400-acre farm, increased its value by 40%, successfully invested in municipal bonds and real estate, maintained detailed financial records, and built relationships with contractors, suppliers, and neighbors, who all consider me a shrewd and capable businesswoman." She moved around the table with deliberate steps, her gaze never leaving her son's face. "In contrast, you've defaulted on 2 business loans, filed for bankruptcy once, been divorced twice for financial irresponsibility, and gambled away your inheritance from your father's life insurance. Your current debt exceeds $60,000, and you haven't filed accurate tax returns in 3 years. Richards looked increasingly uncomfortable as Dorothy continued her methodical destruction of Michael's credibility. "You want to claim I don't understand the value of money? I turned a modest farm into a multi-million-dollar operation. You turned a thriving car dealership into a bankruptcy filing. You want to claim I'm being manipulated? You tried to manipulate me into believing my life-saving medications were unnecessary, nearly killing me in the process." Michael started to speak, but Dorothy held up her hand. "I'm not finished. You want to claim Maria is exploiting me? In 5 years, she's never asked for anything beyond her modest salary. She organizes my medications, drives me to appointments, grocery shops, cooks meals, and provides emotional support. Meanwhile, you visit twice a year, call only when you need money, and view me as a retirement account rather than a human being." Olivia finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, I know Michael's approach is wrong, but surely there's a middle ground. Some way to preserve family unity while preserving our inheritance?" Dorothy's tone was gentle but cutting. "Olivia, there's no middle ground between respect and disrespect. Between seeing me as a person worthy of care and seeing me as an obstacle to your financial security." She returned to her seat, her posture straight and her expression calm. "Evelyn, please show them the documentation." Evelyn opened a thick folder and began spreading documents across the table. Complete medical evaluations from Dr. Peterson and 2 independent physicians, all confirming Mrs. Henderson's mental acuity. Cognitive assessments showing above-average function for her age group. Financial records demonstrating careful money management over decades. Character references from community leaders, business associates, and friends. Richards examined the papers with growing dismay. His case was evaporating before his eyes. "Furthermore," Evelyn continued, "we have extensive documentation of Mr. Michael Holloway's concerning behavior, recorded phone conversations where he discusses his mother's estate as if it already belongs to him, witness statements about his medication interference, evidence of his financial desperation and gambling problems." Dorothy watched her son's lawyer realize that he'd been handed an unwinnable case. Michael himself seemed to be grasping the magnitude of his strategic error, attempting to prove his mother incompetent while simultaneously demonstrating his own complete lack of judgment and moral character. "There's one more thing," Dorothy said quietly, her voice ringing with finality. "Michael, you seem to believe you have some legal right to my estate. Let me clarify something. You don't. I have the absolute right to dispose of my property as I see fit. Your sense of entitlement is not a legal claim." She stood again, this time moving toward the door. "I've made my decisions based on who has shown me genuine care and respect over the years. Maria has earned my trust and affection through 5 years of selfless service. You've forfeited any claim to either through your own choices." Michael's composure finally cracked completely. "You can't do this. I'm your son. I have rights." "You have the right to earn my respect," Dorothy replied with devastating calm. "You chose not to exercise that right. Now you'll live with the consequences." As she reached the door, she turned back one final time. "Olivia, you still have time to decide what kind of person you want to be. But you can't remain neutral in your own family's crisis forever." Dorothy walked out of the conference room with Maria and Dr. Peterson flanking her like an honor guard. Behind them, she could hear Michael's voice rising in desperate anger, his lawyer trying to calm him down. and Olivia beginning to cry. The war was over. Dorothy had won decisively, completely, and with the kind of strategic brilliance that would be talked about in Cullman for generations. But as she stepped into the afternoon sunlight, she felt no triumph, only the profound sadness of a mother who had been forced to defend herself against her own children. The victory was absolute. The cost had been everything she'd once believed about family love. 6 months later, Dorothy stood in the doorway of what had once been her master bedroom, watching Maria's youngest daughter, Isabella, arrange her stuffed animals on the window seat that had been Dorothy's reading nook for decades. The sight should have brought a pang of sadness. This room held 40 years of memories with her late husband, but instead, Dorothy felt only warmth as the house filled with the sounds of a new family life again. "Abuela Dorothy, look!" Isabella called, using the affectionate title that had emerged naturally over the past months. "Mama said I could put my books on your special shelf." "They look perfect there, mija," Dorothy replied with a smile, noting how Maria had carefully preserved the family photographs while making space for her children's belongings. The transition had been handled with the same thoughtful care that Maria brought to everything, respectful of the past while embracing the future. Dorothy's new cottage, built where the old equipment shed had stood, was a masterpiece of efficient design. 800 square feet of carefully planned space that included a full kitchen, a comfortable living area, a bedroom, and a bathroom, all designed for aging in place. From her front porch, she could see the main house, where Maria's family had breathed new life into rooms that had been empty for far too long. The cottage had cost $40,000 to build, money that Michael would have seen as his inheritance being, quote, squandered. But Dorothy had learned to measure value differently now. Every morning, she woke to the sound of children getting ready for school, Maria singing softly in the kitchen, and the general bustle of a family that was grateful for their blessings rather than resentful of their circumstances. "Mrs. Henderson?" A voice from her garden gate interrupted her reflection. Thomas stood there, holding a bouquet of freshly cut sunflowers, his appearance dramatically different from the shambling, desperate man who had participated in the medication prank 6 months ago. He was clean-shaven, clear-eyed, wearing work clothes that were dirty from honest labor rather than stained from spilled beer. Thomas. Dorothy felt genuine pleasure at seeing her youngest son. Of all her children, he was the only one who had truly understood the magnitude of what they'd done, and worked consistently to make amends. "I brought these from the North Field," he said, offering the vibrant flowers. "Thought you might like them for your kitchen table." Dorothy accepted the bouquet, noting the calluses on Thomas's hands, evidence of the farm work he'd been doing without pay for the past 4 months. He'd been sober for 5 months now, attending AA meetings in the next town over and working with Pastor Maxwell on what he called his spiritual inventory. "They're beautiful. Have you eaten lunch? I was hoping you'd ask." Thomas's smile was genuine, free of the desperate neediness that had characterized their interactions for years. Maria said she made extra enchiladas. They walked toward the cottage together, and Dorothy marveled at how comfortable these visits had become. Thomas came by 3 times a week now, sometimes to help with farm maintenance, sometimes just to talk. The conversations were different now, honest in a way they'd never been before. "Got a letter from Olivia yesterday," Thomas said as they settled on the cottage porch with their lunch. Dorothy waited, no longer pressing for information about her middle child. Olivia's path to redemption was more complicated than Thomas's. Her guilt was mixed with resentment, her love with calculations about inheritance that she couldn't quite abandon. "She wants to bring the kids for Christmas. Daniel, too, says she's ready to apologize properly." "And what do you think?" Thomas chewed thoughtfully before answering. "I think she's scared that if she waits much longer, it'll be too late. Chloe's been calling her out on the family drama. Kids got your backbone, Mom. Doesn't let adults get away with being stupid just because they're adults." Dorothy smiled at the mention of her granddaughter. Chloe had visited twice since the legal confrontation, both times bringing a clarity and moral courage that made Dorothy proud and hopeful for the future. "What about Michael?" Thomas's expression darkened. "Still sending crazy letters to anyone who will listen, trying to get the state attorney general interested in elder abuse charges against Maria. Posted something on Facebook about, quote, immigrant families taking advantage of senile old people." Dorothy sighed. Michael's descent into bitter conspiracy theories had been painful to watch, even from a distance. His financial situation had grown more desperate, his isolation more complete, as Cullman's community made clear their opinion of his behavior. "He could come back, you know," Dorothy said quietly, "if he ever truly understood what he did wrong and committed to real change. The door isn't locked forever." Thomas studied his mother's face, seeing both the pain and the profound resolve there. "But it would have to be real change, wouldn't it? Not just apologizing because he needs money. Real change." "Real change," Dorothy confirmed, "like yours." They ate in comfortable silence, watching Maria's middle son Carlos practice soccer in the front yard. At 14, he moved with the fluid grace of someone who had found his passion, and Dorothy had quietly arranged for him to attend soccer camps that would position him for high school scholarships. "Mom." Thomas's voice carried a note of uncertainty that made Dorothy look up. "I know I don't have any right to ask this, but I've been wondering about the future. About my place in all this." Dorothy set down her fork, recognizing the moment of truth that had been building for months. Thomas had been working without pay, attending AA meetings religiously, and slowly rebuilding his relationship with her. But he was also 45 years old, with no savings, no clear career path, and a history of poor decisions. "I've been wondering about that too," she said carefully. "What do you see for yourself?" "I'd like to keep working the farm. I'm good at it, and I like it. Makes me feel useful in a way I haven't felt in years. But I know the land belongs to the trust now, and Maria is the manager. I don't want to assume anything." Dorothy had been hoping for this conversation. Over the past months, she'd watched Thomas develop a genuine relationship with the land and the work. More importantly, she'd watched him develop genuine respect for Maria's authority and skill as a farm manager. "Maria and I have been discussing that," Dorothy said. "She could use a full-time assistant manager, someone who knows the land and the community, someone she can trust." Thomas's face lit up with hope and disbelief. "You'd do that? After everything?" "I'd do that because of everything," Dorothy replied, her voice firm. "Because you've shown me real change is possible. Because you've earned a second chance through your actions, not your words." From the main house came the sound of Maria calling the children for their afternoon snacks, and Dorothy felt the deep satisfaction of a life well structured, a foundation properly laid. The farm would continue. The children would grow up with opportunities their parents never had. Thomas would have meaningful work and a chance to rebuild his life properly. And Dorothy would spend her remaining years surrounded by people who valued her for herself rather than her bank account. "There's one more thing," she said, pulling a sealed envelope from her pocket. "I've established a small trust fund for you. Not enough to make you wealthy, but enough to give you security if you continue making good choices." Thomas's eyes filled with tears as he took the envelope. "Mom, I don't deserve." "You're earning it," Dorothy interrupted gently. "Every day you choose sobriety. Every day you show up to work. Every day you treat me and Maria and her children with respect. You're earning it." As the afternoon sun slanted across the cottage porch, Dorothy reflected on the strange mathematics of love and loss. She'd given away millions of dollars, lost 2 of her 3 children, and handed over control of the farm she'd managed for decades. But she'd gained a daughter in Maria, kept a son in Thomas, and created a legacy based on genuine care rather than financial obligation. The arithmetic of love, she realized, didn't follow the same rules as the arithmetic of money. In the distance, she could see Michael's old trailer, empty now since he'd moved back to Birmingham, to chase increasingly desperate schemes for financial recovery. The sight still brought a flicker of sadness but no regret. Some lessons Dorothy had learned could only be taught through consequences, and some people only learned them after it was too late. But for those willing to change, willing to earn rather than expect, willing to love rather than simply take, for those people, it was never too late to build something real. As Thomas helped her clear the lunch dishes, Dorothy felt the deep satisfaction of a foundation properly laid. Whatever time she had left would be spent on solid ground, surrounded by people who had proven their worth through actions rather than accidents of birth. The new foundation, she knew, would last. 2 years after the legal confrontation that had irrevocably split her family, Dorothy Mae Henderson stood in the bustling kitchen of Santos Family Restaurant, watching Maria direct the evening rush with the same calm efficiency she'd once brought to managing medications and doctor's appointments. The restaurant, housed in a lovingly renovated storefront on Cullman's main street, hummed with the comfortable energy of a business built on genuine care for both food and community. Abuela Dorothy, Table 6 wants to know if you made the apple pie, called Sophia, Maria's eldest daughter, as she balanced 3 plates with the practiced grace of someone who'd grown up in restaurant kitchens in Guatemala before immigrating to Alabama. "Tell them I supervised," Dorothy replied with a smile, noting how naturally the title of grandmother had settled around her shoulders. At 80, she moved more slowly than she once had, but her mind remained sharp, her involvement in the restaurant's success a source of daily satisfaction. The business had grown beyond anyone's expectations. What began as Maria's dream of a small cafe had evolved into Cullman's most popular restaurant, serving a fusion of traditional Mexican dishes and comforting Southern fare that drew customers from 3 counties. Dorothy's silent partnership had provided the initial capital, but it was Maria's culinary skill and unwavering vision that had created something truly special. Mrs. Henderson, a young woman, approached hesitantly, and Dorothy recognized her as one of the first recipients of the Immigrant Student Scholarship Fund she'd established. "I wanted to thank you again. I start nursing school at Alabama A&M next month." Dorothy felt the familiar warmth that came with witnessing lives transformed by opportunity. The scholarship fund had grown into one of the region's most impactful educational programs, helping dozens of students access higher education that would have been impossible otherwise. "Congratulations, Elena. Your mother must be very proud." "She is, and she says to tell you that you're proof angels walk on earth," Elena replied, her eyes shining with gratitude. As the dinner rush wound down, Dorothy found herself reflecting on the strange arithmetic of loss and gain that had defined the past 2 years. She'd lost Michael entirely. Her eldest son had moved to Texas, chasing increasingly desperate get-rich-quick schemes and maintaining his bitter narrative about manipulation and betrayal. His Christmas cards, when they came at all, were signed with a cold formality that broke her heart while simultaneously confirming the rightness of her choices. Olivia's relationship with Dorothy remained complicated, but it was slowly healing. Her daughter visited quarterly now, bringing genuine apologies and taking careful steps toward rebuilding trust. The process was slow. Olivia still struggled with reconciling her love for her mother with her deep-seated resentment about the inheritance she'd lost. But Dorothy could see real effort beneath the awkwardness, a desire for connection that went beyond money. Chloe, now 18, and in her freshman year studying nursing, had become the crucial bridge between generations. She spent summers working at the restaurant and volunteering at the senior center Dorothy had helped expand. Her clear-eyed assessment of her family's failures and her grandfather's legacy provided hope that some branches of the family tree would grow strong and straight. Thomas had exceeded even Dorothy's cautious optimism. 3 years sober, he'd married Elena Vasquez, a kind, dedicated teacher from the neighboring town, and they were expecting their first child in the spring. His transformation from desperate, approval-seeking youngest son to responsible farm manager and respected community member had been the most profound redemption Dorothy had witnessed. "Ready to head home?" Maria asked, appearing at Dorothy's elbow with the gentle attentiveness that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. Home. The word carried layers of meaning now. Dorothy's cottage on the farm property had become more than just a residence. It was the center of a chosen family that functioned with the kind of deep love and mutual respect she'd always hoped her biological family might achieve. As they drove through the Alabama countryside toward the farm, Dorothy reflected on the quiet conversation she'd had that morning with Dr. Peterson, now officially retired but still her friend and occasional medical consultant. Her latest tests showed what they'd both expected. Time was becoming a more precious commodity. Her heart, managed carefully for years, was showing signs of increasing fatigue. Her diabetes required more vigilant monitoring. At 80, she was living on borrowed time, but it was time well spent. "I've been thinking about the final arrangements," she said as Maria turned into their long, familiar driveway. Maria's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel, but her voice remained steady. "What kind of arrangements, Signora?" "The will is complete, of course." You know most of what's in it. But I want to discuss the letter I've written for Michael. They'd had this conversation before, but Dorothy felt compelled to revisit it as her health steadily declined. The letter, to be delivered only after her death, represented her final, most heartfelt attempt to reach the son who had chosen bitterness over reconciliation. It offered no money, no inheritance beyond the symbolic dollar required by law, but it did offer something potentially more valuable, a roadmap back to dignity and family connection, if he ever chose to follow it. "Do you think he'll read it?" Maria asked as they settled on Dorothy's cottage porch, the familiar ritual of evening conversation that had become precious to both women. "I don't know, but I had to try. He's still my son, despite everything." The farm spread out before them in the golden light of sunset, 400 acres of productive land that would continue feeding families and supporting the community long after Dorothy was gone. The land trust she'd established ensured its agricultural character would be preserved, while Maria's skilled management guaranteed it would prosper for generations. "I've been thinking about legacy lately," Dorothy continued. "What we leave behind. What truly matters in the end." Maria waited with the patience that had always been one of her greatest qualities. "Michael thought legacy was money passed down through bloodlines. But I think real legacy is the lives you touch, the positive changes you create, the love you spread that continues to grow after you're gone." Maria reached over and squeezed Dorothy's hand, a silent affirmation. As if summoned by the mention of legacy, headlights appeared on the farm road. Thomas's pickup truck pulled into the yard, and Dorothy saw her youngest son and his wife Elena step out, Elena's pregnancy beginning to show in the careful, joyful way she moved. "Thought we'd stop by and see how the restaurant went tonight," Thomas called, approaching the porch with the easy confidence that had replaced his former desperate neediness. "Very well," Dorothy replied, watching Elena settle into the porch swing with the satisfied exhaustion of someone who'd spent the day teaching third graders. "Elena, how are you feeling?" "Like I'm growing a soccer player," Elena replied with a laugh, rubbing her expanding belly. "This baby has strong legs." As they talked about baby preparations, restaurant business, and farm management, Dorothy felt the deep satisfaction of a life that had found its proper shape. The family gathered on her porch bore no blood relation to her, except through Thomas, but they represented the kind of love she'd always hoped to cultivate: respectful, supportive, genuine, and free from the toxic expectations that had poisoned her relationships with Michael and, to a lesser extent, Olivia. "Abuela," Sophia called from the main house. "Phone call for you. It's Chloe." Dorothy made her way to the phone, marveling as always at her granddaughter's impeccable timing. Chloe seemed to sense when connection was needed most. "Grandma, I hope I'm not calling too late." Chloe's voice carried the warmth and strength that reminded Dorothy of herself at that age. "Never too late for you, sweetheart. How's school?" "Challenging, but wonderful. I'm learning so much about patient advocacy, and I keep thinking about what you went through with the medication incident. It's made me passionate about elder care rights." Dorothy felt tears prick her eyes. Chloe had transformed the family's darkest moment into motivation for protecting others. That was legacy. Pain transformed into purpose. Suffering that created wisdom to prevent future suffering. "I wanted you to know," Chloe continued, "that I've declared a specialization in geriatric nursing. I want to work with elderly patients who might not have family advocates." "Your grandfather would be so proud," Dorothy whispered after the call ended. Dorothy returned to the porch, where her chosen family continued their gentle evening conversation. The stars were emerging in the clear Alabama sky, the same stars that had watched over the farm for generations. "You know what I realized today?" Dorothy said, settling back into her chair. "I spent most of my life trying to build a family legacy based on land and money and blood relationships. But the real legacy, the one that matters, is this." She gestured to encompass the porch, the family gathered there, the thriving farm beyond, the restaurant in town that employed 15 people, the scholarship fund that was changing lives, the senior center that provided community for isolated elderly people. Love that's earned rather than expected. Respect that's given freely rather than demanded. Care that comes from choice rather than obligation. That's what lasts. Maria reached over and squeezed Dorothy's hand. You've built something beautiful, Senora. Something that will keep growing long after we're all gone. As the evening deepened and the family began to drift toward their respective homes, Dorothy remained on her porch, looking out at the land that had shaped her life and the people who had given it meaning. Somewhere in Texas, Michael was probably drinking alone and nursing his grievances. Somewhere in Atlanta, Olivia was probably struggling with guilt and resentment in equal measure. But here, on this porch, surrounded by the sound of children's laughter and adult conversation, and the endless whisper of the Alabama wind through the pecan trees, Dorothy had found the peace that comes from living according to one's deepest values. She had hidden their inheritance, just as they had hidden her medicines. But while their hiding had nearly killed her, hers had given birth to something far more valuable than money, a legacy of love that would endure for generations. The arithmetic of revenge had become the mathematics of redemption, and the equation balanced perfectly. As Dorothy prepared for bed in her cottage, she offered a prayer of gratitude for the bitter lesson that had taught her the difference between family and blood, between love and expectation, between legacy and inheritance. Some gifts, she had learned, could only be given to those wise enough to receive them, and some love could only be shared with those brave enough to earn it. The stars over Alabama shone down on a woman who had transformed betrayal into wisdom, cruelty into kindness, and loneliness into the richest kind of family love. Dorothy Mae Henderson slept peacefully, surrounded by the quiet hum of a thriving farm and the knowledge of people who loved her for exactly who she was, rather than what she could give them. Her legacy was complete. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.